Michael Thompson, thank you for coming today.
My pleasure.
You have such a remarkable story, a journey that has brought you through so many different roads, so many different legal battles, so many moments of violence and turmoil. And you entered the California prison system at 22 years old, 1973, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And you were you're still a big guy. How tall do you stand, Michael?
Used to be 6'4". I think I've lost a fraction of an inch, perhaps.
Yeah.
The boots help.
So at 6'4", you were a big guy,
Mm-hmm.
and you were a prime candidate for one of the most notorious organizations, the Aryan Brotherhood.
Yes.
Known as the AB, or the brand, as they call it. What was your initial interest in joining that organization? Was it to protect yourself?
Actually, I didn't have any interest in joining the organization. It's not something that I pursued. I was approached. Initially, I was approached by the Field Marshal of the Black Panthers, Hugo Yogi Pinnell. And I declined his offer, and as a result of that, he and I went head up the next day. But after that, T.D. Bingham approached me. And T.D. is one of the original members. And his pitch was a little bit different than Yogi's, but a pitch nonetheless. And of course, I had no knowledge of the Aryan Brotherhood, any more than I did about the Black Panthers or any other group. But I declined TD also. And so my interest was not in joining an organization, a group, a gang, any of that. I essentially, up to that point, was doing my own time. And by some estimations, it was hard time. I was involved in a number of altercations and essentially handling my own when approached by the AB. It was some time later, some months later, when I was approached by 4 Native American members of the Aryan Brotherhood that essentially just explained to me that as an old res dog, which I am, having grown up on a reservation, that they lived better in prison than they did on the reservation. Now, that resonated with me. So I asked them to explain themselves, and they did. And it was Bear Clemens that was talking to me. He was a Pit River brother. Unfortunately, he was killed by the Aryan Brotherhood once he retired.
Now, to join the Aryan Brotherhood, you have to presumably put in some work, and they only took on the most elite white inmates. Is that correct?
Physical prowess has a lot to do with becoming a member of the brand, but more so than anything else, it's kind of holistic. It's the idea that one individual can go to any prison within the system and take control based on his, not only his physical prowess, but his ability to control other men.
And you mentioned that you really fell out of love with the Aryan Brotherhood when you realized your principles were starting to get negatively impacted by the group, and your whole stand was against family, women, and children. You would never want to harm them. Mm-hmm. And when the AB decided to take off on a family member of a guy they couldn't get to, that was your line in the sand moment. Is that correct?
It really was. I mean, there were circumstances leading up to that, not the least of which was the assassination of Margot Compton, her 2 six-year-old daughters, and her boyfriend Gary. But in addition to that, they had executed father of Stephen Barnes. Now, that conversation started with the idea of assassinating his wife and daughter, and then his mother and father. And in the end, it simply ended up being his father, who was assassinated.
And that just didn't sit well with you at all?
No, it didn't.
What in terms of violence, you believe that would only be towards a fellow combatant, someone that signed up for the game, right?
It would. To this day, I still don't have an issue with it. Man to man, you're in the mix, and someone calls you out, then you of course have the option as to whether or not to answer that call or not. But by virtue of being in the mix, you know what you're up against.
You mentioned the AB had it very, very good in prison. You mentioned you had a bottle of wild turkey in your cell. You had a CB at one point in your cell.
Yes.
And you had the warden himself on the payroll.
Yes.
Can you talk more about that?
Sure. I mean, it was a result of being in the leadership role that I was in, so it was negotiating with the administration. In this case, it was the warden, who was taking $50,000 a pop to allow the transportation of methamphetamine and heroin into the institution by his staff. And you want to remember, this is back in the 70s, so you certainly wouldn't see that today. But back then, it was not unheard of. Just the very fact that staff at that time made by way of salary just above minimum wage. And minimum wage back then wasn't much. So if you paid staff $10,000 to bring a shipment in, that was a half a year's salary.
You also mentioned that you guys basically extorted Charlie Manson by virtue of having his groupies, his female cohorts, smuggle in different weapons. Was that something that changed the game for the AB? Was that a game changer in the California state prison system?
I think it was, and the reason for that is that prior to that, weapons that you used in your knife fights or in warfare combat in general, you made from materials available to you in prison. Whether, say for instance, you were in a hole, so you had to cut a piece off of a bunk, and then you had to hone that into a knife, sharpen it, handle it, and of course get it out to the yard where you were going to use it. When I brought Mansons Girls into the picture, I had just learned how to beat the metal detectors and simple physics, but actually had them run test runs at the San Francisco airport, metal detectors they had out there. So eventually what I had them doing was bringing in buck knives. So whereas my opponent may be using a piece that he had fashioned from a blank of steel off his bunk, I and others were using folding buck knives.
Would you say most of the most dangerous hand-to-hand combat would involve a shank, a prison shank, knife?
It does, yes. It isn't to say that you cannot use those disciplines toward taking a weapon away from somebody and using it on them. I've done that myself, and I've seen others do it. But knife fighting, the skill itself, has real value.
There's a real famous Filipino knife fighter, and I've seen different philosophies. Some people say to hold the knife point up, others say to hold it, down. What was your style in terms of when you knife fight?
Depended on the fight I was in. Going back to Yogi Pinnell, when he and I met head up the next day after I refused his offer to join the Black Panthers, he had fashioned a knife, or someone had fashioned for him a knife that was dagger style. It was drawn back on both sides. Usually those type of weapons are used for stabbing as opposed to slicing or cutting. The weapon that I made was drawn back on one side only, and I put a slight curve in it so that I used it in part backward against my forearm.
Is it the slice that kills you or the stab?
It depends on the fight itself. Back in the day when you had actually time to engage in a knife fight, even though you were under the gun, you had the opportunity to bleed your opponent if that's what you chose to do, or if you even had that skill set. But I believed in bleeding my opponent as to stabbing. And it keeps the person at bay. If your circumstances become close quarter, then that changes your style of fighting insofar as how you fight. My preference was to bleed my opponent. That changed too, I should add, that you were no longer able to engage in knife fights like that years later. You just simply didn't have the time.
Just curious, why would the Black Panthers seek you as a candidate, being a Caucasian male with Native American descent?
I was involved in an altercation in another prison. And as so oftentimes happens, the inmate grapevine, the prisoner grapevine, my escapades, if you will, in that prison, as it relates to what I was doing and how I was doing it, preceded me. So, the reason that I was involved in that altercation at the previous prison was because of my spiritual practices. So they were perceived as devil worship because no one really knew what Native practices were back then. And as such, I was attacked based on that. So those altercations, one, the fact that I had a certain skill set, and two, that I was Native, preceded me. So I think that when Yogi, who was not actually black himself, he was Nicaraguan, but he was a field marshal for the Black Panthers back then, when he approached me, he acknowledged my exploits at the other prison. So he already knew what had happened.
So the Black Panthers were a multi-ethnic group of people. It wasn't just for black inmates.
No.
Yeah. Okay.
No. Yeah. It very diverse, which was intelligent on their part.
How did you interact with other leaders of elite prison gangs from different races? Did you have a mutual respect with each respective leader?
Yes. Joe Morgan was leader of the Mexican Mafia at that time. Highly respected man, very intelligent man, and a friend. And, I always maintained the utmost respect for him. But the same can also be said of Hugo Yogi Pinel, who, I engaged in knife combat with and defeated. But I had the utmost respect for him. It's one of the things that actually appealed to me was that level of respect. I'll give you an example. Now, Yogi and I went head up in a knife fight, and I was shot in the process, and he lost the fight. But thereafter, we would go to the visiting room together in Old Folsom together. And because we had a mutual respect, not only for ourselves, but for our families, so that we were not going to engage in combat in the visiting room, even though we had access to each other there, and could probably bring about some form of advantage in that. But there was that mutual respect, so we didn't step across that line. We didn't involve family in what we were doing otherwise, and would never subject them to any kind of violence. So, but to answer your question, yes, there was a mutual respect.
I assume the white inmate population wasn't as big as the other races, right?
Yeah, they actually represented a minority, in that context. So back then, the majority population was around between 60 and 70%, and that was black.
And were white inmates treated like shit in that era?
I don't think it was so much that they were treated that way. It had more to do with other individuals, whites, neo-Nazis in this case, that would incite their agenda openly. And it would reach a point of no return, so to speak, with the blacks. So that you would see the blacks taking off on white inmates that really had nothing to do with what the neo-Nazis were doing. The problem with that is that when that riot would occur, the neo-Nazis were nowhere to be found. They were hiding out. And so who would suffer were the regs, the general population that really didn't know what was going on. And the blacks being angry didn't care. They were just striking out as a result of the comments that the neo-Nazis had made. So that's why actually I took it upon myself to remove the neo-Nazis from the prison because of what they were doing and how they were doing it.
What do you think of the way California breaks down its prison politics? It's a very racial divide. Mm-hmm. A lot of other states don't really have that. There's some separation, but they can commingle. But in California particularly, there's so much segregation. Why do you think that is?
Well, it's a control mechanism, you see, and it's not one that is necessarily imposed by the administration or law enforcement in general. It's actually the prison population that does that. and that's also for the purposes of control. If, for instance, you have whites intermingling with blacks or Mexicans or otherwise, and it isn't to suggest that that doesn't happen, it does. But you want to remember that at the forefront of all of that is the economic base. The economic base represents the power base. So that the control is that you don't do certain things in order to maintain your economic base. In other words, you don't want a white inmate buying drugs from a black inmate, because that now infringes upon your economic base. So, as in most things, it comes down to economics. So the premise was that it would be treated like a business. And as such, those revenues that you generated principally would go back to the brand by way of the development of that infrastructure, which included legitimate businesses on the street, taking care of the brand members' families, resources being made available to the family members, as well as the brand members themselves.
Did you tell me T.D. Bingham had a Jewish descendancy?
Yes, he does. I believe his mother's Jewish.
Right.
And T.D. wore the Star of David tattooed on him.
Right.
And, first time I noticed it, he noticed that I noticed it and made reference to the fact that, yes, he was Jewish and proud of it, but that, in his words, he was not a practicing Jew.
And I think that's a misconception. A lot of people hear the term Aryan, rough and tough white guys are members of this organization, so they think it's a racially motivated entity that's a white supremacist entity, which it's not. It's a business enterprise.
It was back then. It was a business enterprise, and so if you look at the logo, if you will, that designates a brand member, that's a Shamrock. And that harkens back to the origins of the brand itself and the original members, all of whom were predominantly Irish. And so the Shamrock was used, it is said, by St. Patrick to teach the Trinity to the Irish people. And so using the Shamrock, particularly if you had 666 within each clover of the rock, it was to represent an anti-establishment perspective.
It had nothing to do with the devil, the mark of the beast.
No.
You referenced that they put you on the shelf, meaning death row, at one point.
Mm-hmm.
And you were able to see Tookie Williams and have some light interaction with Tookie.
Mm-hmm.
How would you describe Tookie, and what would you think of Tookie Williams?
I was disappointed in Tookie. I think he was a hell of a guy. Huge man, very intelligent. And I say I was disappointed in ultimately his decision not to step away from certain organizations to which he was affiliated or associated. And by doing that, he essentially signed his death warrant. He was doing such great work, particularly with children. And I think that had such just extraordinary value. And so that, the loss of his life, to me, was a huge waste. He was a phenomenal individual, regardless of his gang activities or otherwise. He had, he wrote children's books.
Right, and he was a full redemptive guy.
Yes.
There was a rumor that went around that Tookie had beaten Arnold Schwarzenegger in a bodybuilding, like an amateur bodybuilding competition, and he had a little thing for him. I don't know how true that was.
Well, Arnold came to San Quentin.
Were you there when he came?
Well, I was locked up. I spent all my time in a hole. So he came to the main line. And he came with a friend of his, Frank Colombo, who was an amazing person in and of himself, strong man. He came and he would blow up a water bottle and, burst it with just his breath.
That's impressive. Rest in peace.
Extremely, yes.
Yeah.
And then he would take bars and bend them. But where your story comes from is the idea that a lot of us were pushing iron back then, Tookie amongst them. And Tookie was a huge man. How much weight he was pushing, I don't know. But we had a 500 club. TD and I both pushed over 500 pounds.
Is that a bench press over 5?
Yes.
Wow.
And the fact of the matter is that Arnold couldn't match that. At best, I think he pushed about 480.
Was weightlifting part of the protocol to be an AB guy?
It wasn't so much to be. I mean, physical preparedness was. So whether you accomplish that through calisthenics, some kind of routine, I reached a point rather where I became so large that it actually got in the way. When your chest is so big or your arms are so big that you find yourself having to swing around both of them, then that's a disadvantage. The only advantage that I ever saw in being as large as I was that if I grabbed a hold of somebody, they weren't getting away, or a snapping bone, which I've done. So it has that advantage. But insofar as, my skill set in fighting in general, it actually got in the way of that.
Right, it was almost counterproductive for you.
Fluidity, when you look at the various elements associated with certain styles of fighting, fluidity is critical. Whether you refer to that as an air element or a water element, or even a striking element such as fire. But even specifically as to your earth stance itself, when you ground yourself, your physical stature can get in the way. This is Michael Thompson, and you're watching CInemills TV.
Michael, there's very few people on this earth that have had as much hand-to-hand, life or death combat scenarios as yourself. Would you, you mentioned you've taken different martial arts and you've adapted almost your own style. Would you consider teaching others your fighting style?
You're not the first one to ask that, and I have considered it, and I probably will. I'm working with other individuals right now to do an exhibition. Of course, I've had to modify my style of fighting over the years and continue to do so, given my age and my physical abilities. There's been a shift that I've had to adapt to, and I have adapted to it. But I have been asked to teach, to train, and I will more than likely do so.
How many physical fights would you say you've had in your lifetime?
Oh, that's hard to estimate.
Could we say over 100?
I don't think as many as 100, but it's certainly half that.
Yeah. One in particular is when you mentioned 7 Latino gentlemen approached you, and some had knives taped in their hands, and you were able to dispatch these guys. Can you explain how that's a possibility? A lot of people thought that was fantastical or a major embellishment.
Had these 7 individuals actually been made members of the Nuestra Familia, which was the dominant gang at that time, then the outcome, no doubt in my mind, would have been different. But that's not the case here. These were 7 individuals that were parishioners of the Catholic Church. And I know that the weapons were supplied to them by the Nuestra Familia, but these weapons were blanks out of boots. You had the boot factory there at the prison that I'm talking about. And they were drawn back on both sides. They're usually good for a neck piece. But they did have them taped into their hands. And what that tells you immediately is that they're not adept at knife fighting. The idea here when you tape it into the hand is just stab. And the truth of the matter is when you have that many people involved, they usually get in each other's way. And it was no different this time. I mean, the entire episode, when I was required to think back on it, reminded me more of a Keystone Cop episode than anything else. Because when they came out of this very large opening in the side of the chapel, they came out in a wedge formation. And when I rolled into the front man and dropped him, the other 6 just kind of stumbled over themselves out into the yard. And so it was really a matter of just moving amongst them and putting them down. I doubt very seriously if any one of them had ever been in a fight in their life. But they were doing what they were told, and I understood that, even then.
Why were they dispatched to kill you? What was the premise behind?
I'd been practicing my ways in the chapel garden as a native. And back then, that was actually against the law. You weren't allowed to speak your language or practice your ways, but I had an arrangement with the Protestant chaplain. If I kept and took care of the chapels, he would allow me to use the garden between to practice my ways. And that's precisely what I was doing. Even at the time of the attack, that's what I was doing. But that was perceived, unfortunately, as devil worship because no one really understood what I was doing or even why I was doing it. So, you know, they had been sent to kill me. And, you know, that's the thing about when you send somebody to do something, it really has to be of their intent, I think, to be successful. But that didn't exist in these circumstances. You know, I've heard people say, oh, he says he took out 7 trained assassins. Well, that's nonsense.
Right.
You know, and if that were the case, if they were in fact assassins who had been trained by the Nuestra Familia, I would probably be dead. But that was not the case. I actually can remember at that point breaking bones. And I felt bad about that because I realized that perhaps the extent to which I went in putting these fellas down was too much.
So you think the priest actually sent those fellas to get you?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I do. He took real issue with my practices. And, you know, I understand that, you know, how he perceived it, you know, the idea of devil worship, especially because he obviously was not aware of native spirituality or what that involved. You know, I had a small hand drum and I had a rattle and I had an eagle fan. And I would dance with my regalia, and I would sing. And, you know, I would smudge with sage, and I had a small smudge pot. And so, you know, just the very idea of how he perceived it, and I've thought about this, you know, how he perceived what I was doing and what that looked like, you know, barbaric to him. And so it's not a question of taking issue with the priest. And again, these were not members of the Nuestra Familia, but they were parishioners of the priest. So I think his dismay was expressed to his parishioners, and the parishioners got together with members of the Nuestra Familia who supplied the blanks to make the knives, and the suggestion that they tape them into their hands because they really didn't know how to use them.
What do you think the greatest weapon a warrior has?
Wow, what a great question. I mean, it really is. You know, I could say, his heart, his skill set, but, and even more than the mind, it's his humanity. You see, because it's that comes to the forefront in any altercation as to whether to kill or not. I've been engaged in many altercations where I had the opportunity to kill and elected not to. And I would like to believe that comes from my warrior code. You see, so it's that sense of humanity that literally imposed itself upon my psychic, upon my discipline, upon my skill set, not to take life. It's not the ability to take life that makes you a warrior. It's the ability to know and to choose not to when you don't have to. You know, some will draw a parallel between Bushido, for instance, and their code of, you know, conduct. You know, what it is to be honorable in the course of combat and how you facilitate that, what you will do and what you will not do. Some people take the attitude that winner take all, and that is not my attitude.
Which is very interesting because a lot of people have painted you as just a violent killer, as a racist, etc. But we're learning today you're none of those things. No. You know, a lot of our audience loves to hear these stories, the war stories, and you could only hear them from an inactive member of an organization. You want to hear mafia stories? Well, you can't have a made guy up here talking mafia stories. Right. We want to hear a little bit about the AB. It's this elusive organization. And you are sitting before us because you've debriefed against that organization. And what are your thoughts when people call you a rat, a stool pigeon? You know, does that personally hurt you, or do you not care?
Well, of course I care. but does it personally hurt me? No. I understand where it comes from. You want to remember that the idea of a rat or a snitch was created and developed by the very organizations that we're talking about. And it was used as a deterrent, towards individuals cooperating against the organizations that we're talking about. You see, so, it goes all the way back to many of us in our childhoods, don't tattletale, don't do this. And I understand that, and I'm in agreement with that as it relates to children. But the problem is that it's a form of propaganda that's used to deter others from cooperating against the very organizations that we're talking about, for that reason. So I don't take issue with it. Someone else's perception of me, what other people think of me, is none of my business. It really isn't, and that's what I truly believe. They, like anybody else, are entitled to their opinion. If I was going to take issue with anything, it would be the disinformation or the lack of factual basis for what a lot of people spout by way of their knowledge of me. I've been in situations where I've listened to an individual tell a story about something that happened, knowing full well that what he's talking about is actually an altercation that I was involved in. Yet he's taken that for himself. Do I take issue with that? No. Why anyone would want to do that, I don't know.
Right.
You see, to me, it's not a matter of bragging or boasting. And certainly I would never want to glorify the degree and extent to which I've engaged in violence. I once made a comment to David Grand with the New Yorker magazine, and he asked me about violence, and I said, I deplore violence, and I do. I said, but I'm very good at it. Now, if you stop and think about that, that's a pretty stupid thing to say. You see, and if I lack anything in my evolution as a human being, it's emotional development, emotional maturity. When I was released from prison here just recently, I realized just how emotionally immature I am. And so oftentimes when I hear these very comments that you're talking about, I think, well, that's pretty immature. However, you see, when I look at the source, especially those individuals who did time just like me, I understand that they too, like me, suffer from that lack of emotional intelligence to evolve in their own humanity.
And I'm willing to bet very few people would say that to your face.
You see, and I don't really think about that either. For me, there is no challenge in it, and I don't take it as a challenge, nor do I take issue with different circumstances by way of challenge. In other words, when I say that I do it, I do for the reasons that I do it, based on my own personal belief system. See, there's no challenge in that to other organizations or other individuals. I'm simply stating a fact. How others perceive me, that is their prerogative. What I do emphasize, however, is that when they make allegations, that others, if they're really interested in that, do a fact check. You see, because everything that I've ever been involved in my life is well documented.
Right, and the irony is you never got any time reduced from your sentence.
No.
By way of debriefing.
No.
And you've also you've kind of picked and choose what you're willing to debrief on and what you wouldn't. Give us an example of something you refuse to be a part of the government's witness plan.
Mm-hmm. Well, even more importantly than that, the fact of the matter is, and few people know this, I never debriefed. You see, that's what a lot of people don't know about me. But, Department of Corrections has a process whereby when an individual steps away from an organization, they debrief him. I never went through that process. You see, what I did was that I was approached by different law enforcement agencies to cooperate with them in different circumstances. One would be the RICO prosecution of 40 individuals back in 2007. Now, I refused to cooperate in that. One, because he was seeking the death penalty, which I oppose. But more importantly, some of the individuals that I knew that the ATF and the feds were using in that case were lying. And I knew they were lying. So I was not going to associate myself with them. So when the ATF and the feds called me in and said, here's what we'd like you to do, I said, no, I won't do that.
And that really pissed them off.
Oh, you better believe it. Then they set about to discredit me in the event that I might support the defense. And that's their get down, that's their game, and that's unfortunate. And these are things that I'll be addressing in the future as it relates to dealing with law enforcement and dealing with the government in general.
Right. Now you find yourself you've got one foot on a slippery surface, the other one on a banana peel. The AB and the inmate population hate you. You're on the top kill list, and the government hates you.
Yes.
So you're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't. Is that feeling of loneliness affected your well-being physically and mentally?
Absolutely not. I'm blessed. I'm married to an amazing woman, an amazing human being that I love and cherish. And I think that any person that can find that in their life is also blessed. So, what outside of that realm, what I experience with my wife is really what matters to me.
How important has your wife been in terms of just a support system for you? She mentioned to me that going through this experience with you has physically affected her.
Yes, it has. Had it not been for my wife, I wouldn't be here. It's that simple.
It's that simple.
Yeah.
No.
I mean, it's more than just a support system. She's been a mentor, and someone that I can talk. Take the issue of PTSD, for instance. You see, I had no clue whatsoever that I might be subject to that. See, had it not been for her in recognizing that and pointing that out to me, I never would have recognized it. And so, not only is she my wife, but in many ways, in addition to being a mentor, she's my therapist.
Yeah.
In that.
She's an amazing woman.
The ability to have someone that you can talk to openly, honestly, and intimately makes a huge difference. And it's something actually that I wish for many individuals who are leaving prison, because like me, they're not prepared. And that's extremely unfortunate. We as a society have a lot of work to do in that regard.
Yeah. What do you think the biggest ill of society is today, Michael?
Wow, what a great question. And I don't know that I'm qualified to answer it. I've often said, all the way back to my original trial, that the world is really all right. The ills are amongst human beings. And so what I advocate, very simply, is open communication, but in that, a form of unconditional love, for our fellow human beings, and how we facilitate that. I would particularly like to see the focus on our youth and what we, as adults or elders, can do toward helping our youth make the transition into adulthood.
You have a quote that I pulled from you that I really like, and you said that the root of all hate is fear.
Yes.
How do we overcome fear, Michael?
Well, by first understanding that it's an innate characteristic in all of us. You see, and it has the capacity to turn us against ourselves insofar as our thinking. But there's a biological description for that, a physiological description, the hormonal process, what happens. I could go into all that, but to be honest with you, it's kind of boring. We're all fearful, all of us. Like I say, it's an innate characteristic. It's how you deal with that fear that makes the difference. You see, and unfortunately, when that fear translates to hate, and why, that's what really concerns me. We have so many hate groups in this country today that it's an issue that needs to be addressed openly as a society. These white supremacist groups, by way of example, these radicalized groups, these individuals taking it upon themselves, or these groups, more importantly, taking it upon themselves to radicalize our youth with the foundation of hate.
Michael, the concept of white privilege, what are your thoughts about it? Do you think it exists, or is that a fabricated concept?
In my mind, it's not at all fabricated. I think there's a historical foundation for it in this country. If you look at the various ethnicities when they first came to this country as immigrants, the Irish immediately come to mind, the Italian immediately come to mind, and how they were perceived by other Europeans. That idea of white privilege, the upper class, then the middle class, and the privilege associated with that. But just by virtue of being Caucasian and the privilege that endows upon an entire class of people, you know, and the suggestion that the United States as a melting pot doesn't have a class system, I think is wrong. I think we do have a class system, you know.
Do you think there's systematic racism in our judicial system?
No question about it in my mind. And I say that only because I've experienced it.
Give us an example of where you've seen the inequality based on race.
I think primarily in sentencing. You know, I've witnessed it myself where you see individuals with the same charges, you know, and I've gone into court with them. When you go into court in that circumstance, especially when you come in from prison, you sit in the jury box. And that's where most matters are litigated from. But I've seen a white individual that was accused of having a knife, for instance, in prison, receive 2 years. A black individual accused of the same crime, very few differences, received 6 years by virtue of nothing more than the fact that he's black. But, you know, that just barely touches the tip of the iceberg as it relates to racism within the judicial system. And I don't doubt that it's a hot button topic. It should be. A lot more conversation needs to occur as it relates to this very issue because it's pervasive.
We've got to change it.
We do.
We have to do that.
You see, and the only way you're going to be able to change it is doing the very thing that we're doing right now, talking about it and having people weigh in relative to it. I mean, this is an issue that's near and dear to my wife, for instance, who deals primarily with black individuals who are accused of some kind of crime that's going to bring them the death penalty. And in the course of that, in her work, she interviews the families, she interviews the individual himself. But what we see there as a result of that process, if you will, is that the racism is pervasive. The approach to dealing with the individual is different than the approach it is in dealing with a Caucasian or a white person. And you find this primarily amongst people of color. And that goes back to that idea of white privilege that we were talking about. You see, that too is pervasive. And it plays a role insofar as how the individual is perceived. And then we go back to that aspect of fear. You see, and what fear does by way of promoting not only white privilege, but the consequences associated with where there's a person of color involved in a crime. And it makes the difference, unfortunately. You know, I had a situation where a black man was killed in Corcoran. He was killed by a black guard, you see, but I happened to write the report on it. And I knew that it was wrong because they had me write the report before the black guard actually shot this man in the head.
Wow.
So 8 guards were indicted relative to that. Now, the majority of those guards were white, and it was based on a conspiracy, what they were calling gladiator fights. They were setting inmates up to fight. But here's my point in bringing up this story. It's certainly not to glorify the killing of individuals, but in this particular case what happened is that the local population would attend barbecues on the weekends held by the guards and their union. Those were the same individuals that comprised the jury pool that a few months later would acquit every guard that was charged.
So, Lady Justice with the blindfold,
Right.
That's all BS.
Right.
Okay. Speaking of reforms, what are your thoughts of putting a man in a 6x9 cell with no yard time, no communication to the outside world, what you refer to as the SHU program, 24-hour lockdown? What are your thoughts on that?
The short answer is inhumane. You know, I hold, and I've said this before, that the worst thing that you can do to a human being is put them in a cage. It changes, it alters that person's humanity forever. You see, if that person has the ego strength to hold on to a part of himself, you know, he might be able to reclaim some of it, as in my case. You know, in many ways I'm blessed insofar as the path that I took. You know, but it's my spirituality that was the foundation for not only my adaptation, but my redemption.
In terms of the direction America's going, are you concerned with this country?
Oh my goodness, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, just the hate groups alone, the various militias, the white supremacy groups, but the hatred, it's at an all-time high. You know, we can look back on a multitude of episodes in the history of America and pinpoint, you know, different times when this country was in upheaval. And then you see something like the Second World War come along and bring people together as Americans. You see, and there's nothing right now that I can see that's doing just that. Bringing, I mean, the partisanship, it's amazing.
We're split down the middle, it feels like.
That's what's so unfortunate. You know, somebody asked me the other day, they said, what are your political leanings? And I said, well, I have none. You see, I'm not Republican, I'm not Democrat. If I'm going to be labeled as anything, it would be a progressive, and that's only because I believe that we need change. And part of that change is leadership, to facilitate that change. Now, there are many people who would say, well, wait a minute, man, here's a cat that spent 45 years in prison. Who is he? Who is he to even have an opinion? Well, first and foremost, I'm a human being, and I have a reasonable intelligence, you know, and the ability to discern when this country is in trouble. And by my estimation, this country is in trouble.
You know, a lot of people are talking, the chatter online is, we're becoming a very soft society. They use the term snowflakes, that our youth isn't tough, and you look at the foundings of our country, and it was founded by pirates, gangsters, swashbucklers, settlers, rough and tough dudes and women that endured a lot. There's also some sad parts of our history, particularly the racism, the slavery, the Native Americans, how we wiped those people off.
Women's suffrage.
Women's suffrage.
Yes.
We've come out of so much fire, and it doesn't feel like our society is really healed, does it? It feels like we're still connected to those old wounds. What is your recommendation to society on how we can detach ourselves from that old trauma?
And it is a trauma, and I agree with you, however fragmented it may be. But I think at issue here, fundamentally, is our Western ethos. You see, and what that means by way of ethics. You know, I think that's really what we're lacking. When you talk about, for instance, children being soft, I don't think it's so much that they're being soft. I think rather it's what they're being offered by way of their own ethos and what that means for them. You know, as a person, as an individual, as a human being. You know, the very idea of love and what that means in relationship, or relationship at all. And I think that's one of the things that we're lacking as a society, is that ability to engage in relationship with intimacy. Oftentimes people confuse intimacy with sexual connotations. And that's not what I'm talking about, you see.
I'll never forget when you said that there's nothing more intimate than taking a man's wind.
That's right.
And that statement really shook a lot of people to its core. But do you think within violence there's art? I mean, as bizarre as that sounds, is there an art to violence?
Oh, I think there must be. You know, it, again, depends on the individual that's exercising that violence, and in what capacity and for what reason. What's the motive? I mean, there are a number of factors, there are a multitude of factors actually that come to play in violence. So that would be the determining factor. One size, I say it all the time, does not fit all.
Well put. If you were the president of the Bureau of Prisons, what changes would you make?
Wow. It's actually something that I've thought about. So, you know, we used to believe that addiction, for instance, was a process of moral turpitude. We now know that it's a disease of the brain. And that's the fascinating thing, particularly as technology enables and allows us to learn more about ourselves as human beings, physiologically, biologically, psychologically, you know, the social connotations associated with that, and of course spiritually, and what that means. And so when you bring those together in balance, you know, within a prison system, your approach to punishment. See, what's the purpose of punishment? You see, that's the key question. And so what do you make available to that person? What, if anything, are they lacking insofar as their humanity? You know, their sense of self. Look at how many people today are seemingly in crises as it relates to their own identity. That's the whole essence behind being able to radicalize our youth, is because they're at issue as it relates to their identity. They simply want to belong, they want a family, they want to be loved. There are a multitude of factors, and the same applies to the federal prison system that you're talking about. How we approach that. How we approach the idea that we're dealing with an incarcerated individual that committed a crime. The idea of redemption. What does redemption mean? How does that person understand the very concept of redemption? You know, over 70% of those incarcerated right now are incarcerated as a result of an addiction. So how do we address the idea of addiction? Particularly when you have pharmaceutical companies that are at the forefront of that addiction. What's being done about that? But going back to your question about the prison system, you see, it would be our approach to how you deal with human beings as human beings.
Would you abolish the SHU program, the 24-hour lockdown?
I understand why they implemented that. It was primarily to deal with the gangs. See, it was a means by which to control, to suppress their control over the inmate population, because that's what gangs do. You see, but regardless of that, you know, the idea of maintaining a human being in a cage 24/7 is inhumane. And as a society, that should be something that we object to, regardless of what law enforcement or administrators, prison administrators, are saying that individual is. Because more times than not, what they're saying that individual is true. But there has to be another way to contend with that, to deal with that. You know, I'll use by way of example, if you'll permit me, child molesters. You see, a lot of people take issue with child molesters. And as a result of my work with them in groups, I'm of the opinion that that is not something that's curable.
These are guys that you'd stick a steel in their neck if they were on the main line with you back in the day.
Yes.
So it's a very interesting moment for you to not look at these guys as insects, but as human beings.
Yes.
And it takes a lot of fortitude to do that, I can only imagine.
It takes more compassion than anything else, and finding that compassion within yourself for another human being. But the issue is, what is the remedy? In contending with homosexuals that have been incarcerated as a result of their violations against children. Now, I've been asked about the death penalty in that relationship. I don't believe in the death penalty, and I don't believe putting an individual to death is something that this society should engage in. It makes no sense to me whatsoever, but instead, that if you understand that this is not a curable disease as it relates to these child molesters, then you have to come up with a humane system by which to contend with them.
Do you think castration is the answer?
I've been asked about chemical castration, sterilization rather, in that capacity. No, I don't. I think that's an invasion against the person, him or herself. But rather, I think what is more appropriate is to recognize the problem and address the problem on a humane level. That may require some form of isolation. That may require go to the point of quarantine, if you will. It may require that for the rest of that person's life in order to protect our children. That may be, you think, too drastic, but not as Europe does, for instance, where you create an environment where that person can live out their life holistically as a human being, but not be able to prey upon our children.
Besides your wife as your best friend, your pillar, your support, your rock, do you have any other friends, or is your friendship circle very small? Do you socialize with other friends, or do you not have that liberty?
I have a few friends. It's not really a question of liberty. When I was very, very young, I realized who my family was. And that occurred as a result of a beating that was administered to me when I was just a very, very little boy. And I went running off into the wilderness. I lived on the reservation, and that beating was at the hands of natives because of the way I looked. And so I ran out into the wilderness, the tree line, and I climbed this rock, and I was up there trying to bring my sobbing under control. I'd been severely beaten. And suddenly I could hear the wind in the trees, and I looked up, and I could see that wind moving in the trees. And I was overwhelmed by the knowledge that just as I was aware of my environment, it was aware of me. And that became my family. And that's been true my entire life. To this day, I still embrace the tree people and the rock people and the four-leggeds, whomever it may be. And that is critical to me and my humanity. And so I don't lack for friends. You know, I find my relationship with my wife to be not only all-consuming, but extremely satisfying as a human being. Beyond that, I may have a few friends that are just that, good friends.
Yeah, you know, we had Braveheart, a 100% Lakota Sioux Native American on our show, and you mentioned rock people, and we discussed rocks.
We don't necessarily have a religion, and that's the one thing that makes, to me, it makes it special. Is it's not necessarily a religion, it's not necessarily spirituality. It's more of, it's definitely a way of life. You're held to the actions, the words you say, the promises you make. You keep yourself to that word. But is there multiple gods? No. You pray to everything that's living. You know, everything has a spirit to itself. Even the rocks, you know, those, to us, the rocks are the oldest being of this planet. And some are older than others. And you could tell which ones are older by, you know, perfectly round rocks, you know, rocks that were shaped perfectly round are some of the oldest spirits in this world, because how did they get that perfect shape? How did they get that perfect spherical shape? And then, you know, and then everything has a breath. Everything is wakar or sacred.
Is that your feeling about rocks?
It is. It's actually, the rock people are one of my totems. You know, I wear one around my neck for a specific reason. But it's, I believe, because I was taught, but I also believe that everything has a voice, everything, particularly the rock people. All that is required of us is that we open our heart, our spirit, if you will, to the rock people, and we'll hear that voice. So that's a form of communication. It's said amongst the native communities that at one time we all spoke the same language, and that includes the rock people and the tree people, the winged ones, the finned ones, all of us.
Michael, there's a book that you're writing, and I believe you've already laid down, 10 chapters so far?
Yes.
Can we discuss the working title of that?
Of course we can.
And you're going to call it War Horse?
I am, yes.
Okay. And was it an emotional experience going back through your life? Was that very tough and difficult for you to do?
Yes. You know, fortunately, in working on this book with my wife, is that I'm talking to somebody that I trust and that recognizes in me the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder as it relates to the experiences I've had in my life. So that when I encounter, for instance, a beating that was administered by the guards that took me the closest I've ever come to death, and in order to tell that story, I have to relive it in my mind. And oftentimes that will re-traumatize me, you know, relative to that experience. And so I'm blessed in that I have in my wife that support system and that person that can walk me through that.
In terms of the future for you, I know you're battling different legal issues in your life.
I am.
A lot of our audience will be shocked to know that you're completely banned from the internet.
Yes.
Twitter, Facebook, Instagram.
Yes.
You can't even or can you email?
No.
You can't even email or surf the internet.
No.
Most people will be like, wait a second, who canceled Michael Thompson? Well, the state authority did, right?
That's right.
Is that unheard of? It almost seems like that's
It's
not even
unconstitutional.
constitutional. Yeah.
It is. Justice Kennedy wrote the opinion on this in a breakthrough case where he essentially said, in this day and age, it is unconstitutional to deny an individual access to the internet. It denies him access to his government, to his family, to social interaction, to medical care. I mean, there are a multitude of factors that come into play here. You know, the legal issues I'm facing are political. And in my own podcast, I'll be addressing that. But I mention it now to make reference to the point that I just recently went to preliminary hearing on these charges. Now, there were 33 charges that had been contrived relative to me. And in this preliminary hearing, this is a hearing that is brought about even before we get to the idea of trial or arraignment on charges. 18 of those charges were dismissed because there was nothing there. And the dozen that remain, there's nothing there either. But they have to hold on to something. Because what initiated this was the politic associated with my release from prison. Many in law enforcement opposed my release.
And it's not because they felt you were a threat. They just wanted to throw you under the jail, basically.
No, here's the issue. We talk about judicial reform. Now, I was released under the Youthful Offender and Elder Offender Act that was enacted just a few years ago. And what that does is it recognizes that the immature brain, you know, oftentimes lacks judgment. And so they take into account the circumstances of the crime itself and the age of the individual associated with that crime. And a multitude of factors are taken into consideration as it relates to that. And they mitigate the crime itself. Something that should have been mitigated at the time of trial but wasn't, because it wasn't allowed. But now it is allowed. So I was released under the Youthful Offender Act and the Elder Offender Act because those circumstances associated with my crime, which I always maintained my innocence on, were taken into consideration. I went to the board 18 times and was denied parole because I wouldn't admit to the crime, you see. But under this, I was released. So the California District Attorneys Association took issue with that. They're not about prison reform or judicial reform. They don't often seek the truth. They don't often seek justice. What they hoped to do was make me the poster boy, to say this is what happens when you release somebody like him from prison under this legislative act. So let's repeal it. And that's what they're actually attempting to do.
Wow. So you're a political pawn at this point.
Yes.
And you're a high-profile guy, so
yes.
This is the moment in time.
Yes. You know, former leader of the Aryan Brotherhood.
Right.
You know, Governor Gavin Newsom released him from prison.
Now look what he did, right?
Yes,
yeah,
exactly.
And you really did nothing. And we won't dive into those weeds, but
no.
Our audience can reach into your podcast. What is your podcast now, Michael?
Thoughts and Observations with Michael Thompson.
With Michael Thompson.
Yeah.
And you don't really go into the AB stuff, or do you kind of dance around different parts of your life?
Yeah, there are different parts of my life. I mean, I tell stories because people are interested in those stories. And my opinion is when those stories have value, in other words, someone in hearing that story can take something from that, something resonates in that has the potential to perhaps bring about some form of change, whatever that change may be. It's up to the individual. Then I hold that those have value.
So your desired outcome is to help people change their lives, and they might relate to you in some way, some
Yes.
fashion.
Yes.
Yeah. Can our audience reach out? Do you interact with people online, or you can't, right?
Well, I do through third parties.
Okay.
I do have permission of the court. I can't access the internet. I can't go online. I have a phone, but it only has text and calls, no media at all. But I use third parties, you know, for that. You know, when I do my own podcast, I have a studio engineer that facilitates that for me.
Okay.
By way of example, my emails are typically either my wife scans those and responds to them, or I have, for lack of a better word, employees
Okay.
that do the same thing.
Is there a general email our audience can reach out to you?
Yes. You have m.thompson@livelearnandprosper.org. That's the nonprofit organization that my wife and I formed while I was still in prison.
Do you reply to different people that might need help or guidance? Or
Absolutely.
Okay, great.
Yes.
Great.
Yeah, I may not be able to go on the email and deal with them, but oftentimes they'll give me a phone number and I'll call them.
Great.
You know, or I'll write letters on behalf of their loved ones who are behind the iron gates.
Yeah. Michael, thank you so much for coming today. We really appreciated having you.
Pleasure's been mine. Thank you.